While insurers had an inherent interest in denying or minimizing compensation, states faced special pressures to reward damaged veterans. As Waller observed, the veteran is always a powerful political force, for good or evil, because he has fought for the flag and absorbed some of the mana. He is sacred. He is covered with pathos and immune from criticism. Overgenerous compensatory policies could, however, ruin government finances as well as stabilize symptoms. Widespread apprehension developed after World War I that the lingering psychological effects of traumas would produce unsustainable numbers of claims for disability pensions. General suspicion of chronic psychological casualties prevailed. The question of who was a deserving beneficiary of financial compensation came to the fore. How could ex-soldiers who had suffered genuine psychic traumas in combat, and therefore truly merited compensation, be distinguished from those who simulated psychic wounds to escape the battlefield or to seek unmerited rewards? Increasing pension costs for treating war neurotics created deep alarm in many nations. In the decade following the war, more than 100,000 British ex-servicemen applied for pensions due to shell shock. By 1918, about 6% of British pensions had been awarded for this condition. An additional 11% were awarded for heart problems, many of which were psychosomatic in nature. The problem of secondary gain from chronic shell shock was paramount. A British commission that investigated the implications of shell shock for post-war society concluded that this class of case excited more general interest, attention, and sympathy than any other, so much so that it became a most desirable complaint from which to suffer. A committee formed in 1939 to investigate the problem of pensions for shell-shocked veterans concluded, "There can be no doubt that in the overwhelming proportion of cases, these patients succumb to shock because they get something out of it." German psychiatrists expected that traumatic neuroses among people who were not otherwise predisposed to become neurotic would rapidly clear. Therefore, soldiers with chronic conditions must have some pre-existing infirmity that made them already prone to become neurotic. One psychiatric advisor to the War Ministry claimed that his review of 463 neurasthenic pensioners showed that 57% had served at home only, and 59% had a pre-war history of neurotic illness or tendency. Other German psychiatrists thought that shell shock victims were cowards and malingerers. In the United States, after the initial victory parades, veterans returned to a hostile social climate marked by widespread unemployment, political intolerance, and growing ambivalence about the costs of American victory. At the end of 1919, psychological cases constituted about 40% of all hospitalized veterans. As in Europe, concern grew over the pension costs and widespread fraud that claims of war-related psychic damage might involve. Two veterans organizations, the American Legion and the Disabled American Veterans of the World War, were major advocacy groups. Their goal was to change perceptions of war neurosis and to make the federal government responsible for mental health care. These groups took special interest in shell-shocked veterans, portraying mentally disturbed soldiers as honorable men, overwhelmed by the horrors of war. They directed their lobbying efforts for veterans toward obtaining better pensions, generous civil service preferences, and expanded eligibility for federal programs. They were often successful. Legionnaires and comrades carved out a privileged legal status for war-disabled vets, one that accorded them monetary and institutional benefits superseding those of all other U.S. citizens. The lobbying efforts of these groups led the federal government to recognize the need to deal with disabled vets on an ongoing and permanent basis. Rehabilitation programs that strove to make incapacitated veterans useful citizens who could work, and thus be saved from unmanly forms of dependency, became firmly embedded in U.S. policy. The rehabilitation movement of World War I marked a major turning point in the development of the veterans' welfare state. It institutionalized the federal government's obligation to restore disabled veterans to a state of masculine productivity.